There is something to be said for the system. Some seem to work within the system, some outside the system, while others simply seem to be able to work the system. In a battle of thrust and parry between two adversaries, it would seem that whoever understands the rules of the system better, navigates it better, and is ultimately awarded victory. So why then would one party, seemingly holding the upper hand in this thrust and parry, suddenly forgo its position and accept the stance of their opposition with seemingly no outward explanation? In an environment where the details required to form sound judgment and comprehension are boxed away, provided on restricted access, and their secrecy enforced, why should we be so surprised? The stunted back and forth of reckoning and reasoning doesn't tend to gel particularly well within the confines of a rigidly structured system, and neither did it here. While emotion and perception seem just as blurred as access to the evidence, we seek an avenue of clarity as we continue with the death of Phil Walsh, here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I am once again, as always, joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Second episode of 2022. That's a lot of twos in a row right there.
Indeed, it is a lot of twos, and we welcome you back to, I guess, what is season 2, if you like, of Just Lawful. So, before we begin, obviously, as always, a huge thank you to everyone listening. If you haven't heard our previous episodes, and indeed season 1, Sean, no 2 in that one, we would strongly recommend and greatly appreciate you going straight over, of course, to iTunes and Spotify, subscribing, rating, reviewing, leaving us a 5-star rating, all of those wonderful things. That's obviously how you can help us get our work out to the masses, and also how you can catch up on the journey so far. Speaking of the journey so far, we are deep into the Cy Walsh situation here in story, and that of his death of his father, Phil Walsh.
Could almost say we're in the third quarter.
Yeah, absolutely. For one of a football vernacular, we're deep in what they call the premiership quarter. We're getting through that. And I just want to sort of, I guess, before we sort of ramble on any further, we left on a few plot points on our last episode. We know that we were steaming toward a trial, working out, trying how do we select an impartial jury that hasn't possibly been tainted in some way. And there was this element of the timing of all of this. When would this happen? How would this happen? What do we do from here? With all that stated, Sean, I'm going to jump straight into it. Where are we? What's the state of play? What's the next call?
August 19, 2016. I wrote these words in the advertiser upon leaving the hearing, that long-awaited hearing, that much-delayed hearing. I wrote, "The son of slain Adelaide Crows coach Phil Walsh was mentally incompetent at the time the crime was committed. Prosecutors will concede."
Hang on, hang on, please, just go back and just for my benefit more than anyone, just go back. So that's different.
That's different.
That's not where we left this off.
Not at all. As you said, we were looking down the barrel of a trial
right,
at that moment.
Talk me through that. How do we? What happened here? How did we get here?
What happened was myself and Adelaide's media turned up for the August 19 hearing. We went in. We weren't sure we were even going to be allowed in because it was going to be what's called a directions hearing.
Sure.
Directions hearings are closed to the public.
Mm-hmm.
We asked for permission to come in. We said, we won't report what's said. We just want to actually come in and get some idea of what's going on here. The DPP said, actually, we'll have the hearing opened, please, Your Honour.
Okay.
We're quite prepared for the media to be in here. And Lucy Board, prosecutor, said, I can indicate that the Director of Public Prosecutions will concede that Walsh was mentally incompetent at the time of the offence, and I understand there will be a similar concession down the track in relation to the objective elements.
So we have taken a very big left turn here from where we were at the end of the last episode.
Massively.
The prosecution was saying, we don't accept this mental incompetence plea. We are waiting on the results of some further testing of a substance that was found.
That's right. Substance found in his possessions at the time of the incident.
Right, and we were going, okay, we are just, channeling along towards a trial process. This is where we're going. You're saying mental incompetence. We're saying, no, we've got some other objective elements and evidence to say to the contrary. Let's put this in the court. But we come back now in August and suddenly formed this capitulation to accept the defence's argument here.
You don't even need a better word. Capitulation is exactly what it is. It was, we are going to fold our tents in the night. We are giving up on this. So much so that the Director of Public Prosecutions himself, who was then Adam Kimber, now District Court Judge, then DPP, issued a public statement to me after the hearing.
Okay.
And he said, "Today the prosecution advised the Supreme Court that it will not oppose the court finding Mr. Cy Walsh was mentally incompetent at the time of the death of Mr. Phil Walsh. The prosecution's position has been reached after reviewing all relevant material gathered by SA Police in the course of its investigation, the reports of forensic psychiatrists who have examined Mr. Cy Walsh, and following consultation with relevant parties. I emphasise that no finding has yet been made by the court." Then he went on to say, "Mr. Phil Walsh's wife, meaning Meredith, has advised that she does not wish to be contacted by the media. I ask that her wishes be respected, and I do not propose to make any further comment."
Okay.
Now that's quite wide, isn't it? We've looked at every single piece of evidence.
Yeah.
We've talked to every single person we need to talk to. We've had all the material come back.
Yeah.
And we now agree that he was mentally incompetent and that the court should make that decision when the time comes.
And I guess we probably need to just highlight there, they've obviously got access to the 7 boxes of documentation you had, but they clearly have access possibly to more than just those 7 boxes, you would imagine?
At this time, I'm thinking there has to be more.
Sure.
Because remember, after reading through all those boxes, I was 50-50.
Absolutely.
I couldn't figure out which way I would have
That's
gone
right.
if I'd been asked. So there has to be something else, a smoking gun, for want of a better term,
Yeah.
that has been found that goes, no, this is the exact thing that we can pin it on and say it is mental incompetence,
Right.
or we as the prosecution can't argue it past this point.
Yeah.
It may not be, let's call it positive evidence.
Mm.
It may not be positive evidence of mental incompetence. It may be evidence that means that you're not going to be able to successfully argue beyond reasonable doubt that it wasn't mental incompetence.
So you can't prove that, right? I do have a question here, because I mentioned it just a moment ago, because so far I haven't heard anything about this, and it doesn't sound like we're going... The substance. We found a substance on Cy at the time of his arrest.
That's right.
And we were waiting for results to come back to tell us exactly what that was. What was it? There's no mention of that here. If this was such an important piece as we thought at the time, where is that sitting with all this?
The 3 worst words in a journalist's vernacular. I don't know.
What do you mean? What do you mean you don't know?
I don't know. We were never told at the time.
Okay.
My questions about it subsequent were never answered. You heard the DPP say himself, "I do not propose to further comment at this time." It's never been brought up in court since. The results of the testing were never made public. The name of the substance was never made public. I've got my suspicions. I'm sure everybody listening has their suspicions as to what it was. 1 + 1 = 2. You're fairly certain what you think it's going to be, but I can't confirm that.
Okay.
To this day, all these years later, I still don't know what that substance was, and I still don't know what the result of the testing was.
That just seems, I won't say, it's just very strange, interesting, odd, intriguing to me that this was such a big thing at the time, which we were pinning the whole concept of we're not going to accept that plea by him.
That's right.
Based on this, and suddenly that's almost just dissipated. It doesn't exist anymore.
And this is the thing. It's unsatisfactory, and in the real world, that's how stories go.
Yeah.
This isn't a crime thriller where we can suddenly turn it on and say to you, it was actually this all along with a dark musical sting, or,
Sure.
here's the 3rd act twist. Sometimes these things just fall away, and as a journalist and as a member of the public, you're simply never going to know unless you've got someone that's prepared to come up and give you the word on the quiet. It just fades into the ether. You have to accept that the system has done the right thing and has analysed this. And, when Adam Kimber says we have the reports of the relevant forensic psychiatrists and everything that SAPOL has gathered, and we've reviewed all that relevant material.
All the relevant material, yeah.
There's 2 options. Either what was in his possession at the time is not relevant,
Right.
or upon review, it doesn't take it past mental incompetence.
Okay. Yeah, okay, look, I mean, it just, as you said, it lingers, and it's one of those things, it's like that, you can't scratch that itch to understand. There is something there that and you and I talked about this in previous episodes, there's this thing, and as much as we'd like to, listeners, we can't give you that answer. So, sorry, no itch to be scratched on that one. So, that's strange. But if that's the case, and regardless of what that was or wasn't, and the importance it did or didn't play, the prosecution now choosing to accept the plea from the defence, that means, so if I'm understanding this right, we now don't need to worry about this selection process for a jury because a jury won't be required because we will no longer need a trial. Is that right?
That's right. The prosecution's saying that we're going to concede mental incompetence, and down the track we'll concede the objective elements as well, what we know from our previous coverage to be the actual crime had the person had the mental capacity to commit a crime.
Yes. So, with that aside, we now, as I said, no trial, no jury. We're accepting that, so we can go and just talk about the objective elements. We can then move to a situation where, if we're all on the same page, we can do submissions. Is that am I right? What's the next step in the process here?
Well, normally, yeah, we'd go straight to submissions on a limiting term.
Right.
How long the limiting term's going to be, what needs to happen.
Yeah.
But you're forgetting one essential element.
Hang on. No substance, trial, jury, submission, object. What am I not? You've lost me here. What am I not? What am I not thinking here? I thought over all this time I would have understood. What am I missing?
Football.
What do you mean? Hang on. What do you mean by football?
Well, we're not going to have a trial in the middle of football season now.
Okay.
But the Adelaide Crows are still third on the ladder,
Right.
and are hot for the premiership in 2016.
So
Maybe we should be putting all of the submissions off until after the football season.
no, hang on. So we've got to this point. We know where we are, and we're not. So we're considering that the football has to be that this element that we've spoken about that shouldn't be part of this conversation in any way, shape, or form still is forming and creating a situation here.
Absolutely. And once again, we're looking at justice being delayed for a football game. Daniel, as you said at the top of the episode, this is season 2. We've been doing this for a while now. You've sat here in the studio with me and you've had what I refer to as the terrible privilege of speaking to people like Julie Kelbin, Steve Egberts, and Arman Abrahimzadeh. I want to ask you something. How would you define a victim of crime?
Someone who has a direct impact to themselves based on their association or relationship thereof to an incident or a circumstance.
Yep. No,
I
that's
think
good.
as best as I could suggest.
No, that's good. That's good. The legislation defines them as someone who has suffered injury, loss, or damage resulting from a criminal offence.
Okay.
Or in the case of a mental health case, objective elements that would otherwise be a criminal offence.
Okay. Yep.
Injury, loss, or damage.
Yeah.
We think of mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters.
Sure.
On August 19, 2016, legal debate centred on the idea of whether the Adelaide Crows were a victim of crime.
An entity. I'm struggling with that. That they're an entity. That's a brand. It's a logo. That's an organisation, which is Adelaide Crows. Possibly, at its extent, the people working within that entity, but not the entity itself. And I've got to be honest, that feels like a big stretch. Meredith, obviously.
Yep.
Any other close family, friends, relatives, I can understand.
Phil's daughter, of course.
Absolutely, all of those situations. The people working within that, maybe some close friends, but again, they're not relatives.
The Trobianis,
yeah,
people
absolutely.
like that.
And I know we had some evidence given by, for example, Kane Corns and people in that sense that were close to Phil. I can't fathom, or it doesn't sit right that an entity A, as in the Crows, or even B, no offence, the people working within the Crows organisation are victims. They would certainly be upset, distraught, hurt, confused, sad, all of those emotions, not victims of crime, I wouldn't have thought.
And yet, this is what was exercising the mind of the legal circles and the Supreme Court, because everyone was wondering whether or not sentencing submissions should go ahead on the 28th of September, which was just 3 days before the 2016 grand final was due.
Okay.
So at this point in August, you have the Crows at third on the ladder.
Right.
They may or may not make the finals.
Okay.
Should we put off the sentencing submissions so that you don't have a great big story about Phil Walsh's death circling in the media immediately before the Crows potentially take the field on that grand day in September?
Right. I guess for me there is a piece around that which I can understand. Do you want that to be the case? However, it goes back to my point before. We're talking about this concept of football again, which is a part of this. It shouldn't be words in this conversation. The conversation should be about the incident that happened, the people involved, the tragic nature of that, and what do we do from that. I'm struggling to understand how a football fixture becomes a part of the legal conversation of that fixture, if that makes sense.
So I asked the Crows that. I questioned them. I said, are you going to hire lawyers? Are you going to make an application for this to be adjourned off?
Right.
The answer I got was, we declined to say whether we will take action, but we are across the details of the case.
We declined to take, but we're across the details. Feels vague.
So I went to the then Commissioner for Victims' Rights, Michael O'Connell. He said, in the context of this particular case, given its significance to the people of South Australia, concerns raised by football clubs or players should be considered. Now, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that, and we'll get to why I don't agree with that in a moment, but that was the position of the now former Commissioner for Victims' Rights.
Okay.
I spoke to Craig Caldecott. We've talked to Craig a couple of times over the course of this series, asking about various legal things. Craig is, of course, with the Law Society of South Australia. He said that would be extraordinarily unusual. Many people would see this as special treatment and the delaying of justice, all for the sake of football. People would ask why the Crows can have a court date changed when victims don't get to read their victim impact statements in court without prosecutors editing them first.
Well, that's a marvellous point, yes.
So I spoke to Patrick Keane, who was then the AFL spokesman. I said, Patrick, are you going to ask that this be put off? The AFL has decided not to have the discussion, said Patrick, because a case as serious as this has to run its due course. So the AFL's like, we're not getting in the way.
Okay.
This needs to be dealt with.
Yeah.
The AFL's of the opinion that justice must run its course.
Okay.
You've got lawyers saying this is special treatment. You've got the Commissioner for Victims' Rights saying, oh, but in the circumstances of this particular case. And you've got the Crows keeping their powder dry.
Right.
I'll be honest. I was mad then. I'm mad now.
Okay.
About the whole concept. And it all comes down to what Craig said just then.
Yeah.
We have a system in South Australia where the definition of victim is based on suffering injury, loss, or damage. I have sat through countless court cases where I have heard defence counsel or prosecution say, well, Auntie Mary can't come give a victim impact statement because even though she loved the dead person, she suffered no injury, loss, or damage. So she's off. Or there's 30 people that want to give victim impact statements, so we're going through and whittling them down to just the ones who have suffered injury, loss, or damage. We have seen the impact that not being able to give a victim impact statement had on Julie Kelvin.
Yeah.
We've seen the impact that having his victim impact statement altered, warped, and changed had on Steve Egberts.
Yeah.
We've seen the absolute release that comes from a unfiltered victim impact statement that Arman Abrahimzadeh had.
Sure.
But we're also sitting in a situation where I have sat through court cases where people have given victim impact statements about their murdered wives on their wedding anniversaries.
Yeah, right.
I have watched mothers and fathers talked about their slain children on the day that their children died, the anniversary thereof, or on their kids' birthdays.
Yeah, right.
I've seen families called into court to give victim impact statements 3 days before Christmas.
Yeah.
When do they get their due consideration? When do they get to say, no, sorry, I'm not going to give a victim impact statement on this day? I'm going to go back to the man who had to give a victim impact statement about his wife's murder on their wedding anniversary.
Sure.
Beautiful, beautiful man, no longer with us. Lost his wife in horrible circumstances. Came in, gave this beautiful victim impact statement. Walked out of court and looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, Sean, it was our wedding anniversary today. And I just said to him, how did you find the strength to do that? He's like, what else am I going to do? Not give a victim impact statement?
Yeah, right.
Or did you tell the prosecution that it was today? Yes, but they told us that was the day the court had set. Now let's go further into that, the date the court has set.
Yeah.
I have watched judges borderline yell at prosecution and defence counsel who are not going to be available for the date that a judge wants to hear a matter because they've got holidays booked.
Right.
I've watched lawyers cancel international trips with their families to be available on a day a judge picks.
Right.
With all that said,
Yep.
the moment a football team says, 3 days before the grand final might be a bit dicey for us, to watch the entire legal system roll over and show its belly and say, what date would you like? Frustrates and angers me beyond belief. If every single one of those other examples I gave had the freedom to say, we would like another date, please, and the court respected it, then the Crows can have whatever date they like.
Right.
But it's all or nothing.
Okay.
Either everyone gets to pick a date that suits them, or no one does.
Yeah, right.
And especially not for something that is a sporting competition, rather than an anniversary, a Memorial Day, something like that, that speaks to that deep emotional core that is linked directly to the crime.
Sure. And not to incite your frustration any further, if I was to, which is, let's face it, my nature to do that, to play the devil's advocate here, could I not concede that by its own definition, the Crows organisation has suffered loss?
Yeah, absolutely.
In its coach and therefore damage to its team, its brand. Therefore, could we consider that they should do that? And is the collective, I guess, nature, impetus, whatever you want to do, of the influence of that over a large society, which is the majority of the state, which are invested in this team and this sporting competition, does that weigh in any way toward your decision? I understand what you said about if the people you've spoken about could choose to objectively change the date that suited them away from anniversaries or birthday, whatever it might be. And perhaps even you mentioned in there as well, didn't have amended, edited, altered victim statements of their own. Putting that aside, does the collective, I guess, size of and the ability to concede that perhaps the Crows are victims here, does that weigh in any way, shape and form into your thought process there?
Absolutely, because the Crows are victims in the sense of injury, loss or damage.
Sure.
They should be able to give some sort of victim impact statement, whether that's someone from the club coming and speaking on the behalf of all the players, whether that's certain individual players coming in, a team captain or someone speaking on behalf of the team, something like that. 100%. They should absolutely be involved. I have no issue with that.
Sure.
It's the special treatment involved in letting them pick the date.
Okay.
If you have a system that, as we've said so many times on this show, does not give victims enough of a voice,
sure,
and can strangle them, censor them, alter them, why should then another victim be given preferential treatment because they're a sporting club?
Yeah. Okay. No,
that's what I object to, the preferential treatment that seemed to be on offer here, and the fact that everyone was just prepared to say, well, it's football. Of course we've got to think that way.
Okay.
No, you don't got to think that way.
Yeah.
You've got to think about the Julie Kelbins, the Steve Egberts, the Arman Abrahimzadehs of this world.
Sure.
You've got to think about the people that have been affected. What do you give them? Well, that's what you give the Crows as well.
Yeah. No, look, understandable. Just wanted to run that concept and just understand where that sits.
Yeah, absolutely.
2 points left I want to understand here. Firstly, for those out at home that may be playing the home trivia game version of this, the Crows didn't make the grand final that year. It was the Sydney Swans and the Western Bulldogs. So it wasn't a factor in that sense in the end. That's one thing. Second part is, what happened? What date was chosen and was it affected by the Crows?
It wasn't, because they went down earlier. They were not going to be part of the AFL grand final. And as a result, everyone went, okay, so that date in September will be fine.
So even though it didn't happen, it was still predicated on the fact that, well, we don't need that anymore.
That's right.
So football still won the day.
Football completely won the day.
Sean, as loath as I might be to bring this moment up and talk about football yet again, we know that the AFL, or should I say the Adelaide Crows, no longer wanted to try to dictate what date that they could take this to give submissions to court. And we know that because of that, we set a court date, so that's going to happen. So now we're going to submissions what happened? When was the date that actually did occur, and what's the next steps? Because we know the DPP has capitulated, accepted, but we also know that we still need to go in front of a court for the court to give its ruling. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And that all happened on September 28th, 2016. And what happened was the DPP came in and they said, we formally concede mental illness.
Sure.
Defence said, we formally concede the objective elements.
Right.
So what you say happened that night in Glenelg absolutely happened.
Yes.
We're not going to query it. We're not going to question it. We're not going to quibble with it.
And that's an interesting point, because as you said just then, and it just kind of clicked for me in that moment, prosecution say, we accept mental incompetence. Defence accepts what you say happened, did happen. So now we know what happened, and we also have an understanding of were we mentally capable to be responsible for that. That's just kind of clicked. We both concede those. We now have an agreement in the middle. Let's make a decision or a determination.
We no longer have a crime. We have a tragedy.
Right.
We have a tragedy that was caused by mental illness.
Yep.
Everybody agrees on that. Lucy Board, the prosecutor, went one step further. We've talked in the show about the fact that you need 2 forensic psychiatrists to agree that someone is mentally incompetent at the time of an offence in order to rule mental incompetence.
Yes, and we heard earlier that in that statement by Kimber that we had statements by psychologists, etc. So we've clarified that. So we've hopefully done that, I assume. We've got that.
That's right. Lucy Board confirmed there were 3 reports. And you know, that always seemed odd to me. If the law requires 2, why would you go out of your way to get 3? Why would you go above and beyond?
Yeah.
It's not something that's really exercised my mind over the years, but I recently learned the answer. Since we've been doing this series about Cy Walsh,
Okay.
I've received phone calls and contacts from various people that have been involved in the case back in the day.
Sure.
One of the things that I've learned is that preliminary diagnosis at Greylands actually led to conversations within South Australia after the incident.
So, and my memory is that was 12 months before the incident occurred.
That's right.
So we're talking 12 months before the incident, and probably now we're a good 12 months beyond the incident of the proceedings here. So within that 2-year period, it's 2 years somewhat there. Yeah, okay.
So what I've only just learned, and this is the first time I've ever talked about this, so brand new news for everybody listening. The psychologists and psychiatrists at Greylands, upon hearing of Phil Walsh's murder, went out of their way to try to contact anyone in South Australia who would listen to them to say, we have information here at Greylands that you need. We have diagnoses, we have notes, we have all sorts of information that will be useful to you. Who wants it? Just put us in touch with an investigator, with a lawyer, with a judge, with a doctor, whomever.
Yeah.
We want to give you this information. It's entirely possible that that information coming from Greylands may well have been what informed the capitulation in the first place by the DPP.
Okay.
I don't know that part for a fact.
Sure.
But the timeline seems to match up.
Yeah, well, it seems interesting. So, and I would, for just pure, and this is that fascination part and intrigue, what was in that report? If you've only just recently, I'm going to assume this is the first you and I have spoken about this.
Yeah.
You maybe don't necessarily know the contents, you just know of its existence.
I know it existed, and I assume that it was much more than that thing that I read in the 7 boxes, which was, again, a preliminary diagnosis.
Correct.
But it's fascinating because when we recorded that episode, you and I were talking about the fact of how come they only got as far as a preliminary diagnosis at Greylands.
Sure.
Turns out they didn't. Turns out they got further. But that was
okay.
something that came later, which meant it wasn't in those 7 boxes of documents. So we get back to that whole concept of why this information isn't made more broadly available to the media at that stage of an investigation.
Beyond the investigation, Sean, I'm just thinking that through. So I wonder how broadly known that was. Clearly it wasn't. Could that have in some way at some point been something that may have helped Cy and his treatment, rehabilitation, his progress within that 12 months since the incident that perhaps may have got him to a place where maybe this didn't have to happen. Who knows?
If it had been known before the incident.
That's what I mean. So not just the investigation piece. I'm going back and going, if we retrofit that over the top, maybe could that have possibly helped in this situation for Cy's own mental health and well-being? And could we, you and I are massive fans of Back to the Future. If only we had the DeLorean and could do something like that, could that have made a difference?
It's fascinating that you've brought that up right now, because there was someone else that felt exactly the same way.
Oh.
And that was Meredith Walsh.
Okay.
After prosecution and defence traded capitulations,
Sure.
Meredith got to give a victim impact statement.
Yeah, right.
Now have a listen to this. My heart remains broken. Our daughter is devastated by the loss of her father. Our son Cy is also shattered by what happened and has to live with the consequences of his illness, an illness that has destroyed our loving family. We all now live with the devastating consequences of a mental illness that was not understood. She said that because Cy was an adult, medical professionals had followed the law and made neither her nor Phil aware of whether Cy was following his treatment plans.
Yeah, right.
There were 2 occasions that doctors told Cy, a mentally ill patient, to continue to take his medications, she said. Because he was an adult, the medical profession, as the law allows, didn't involve any other person with his health care. This is where privacy issues must be reviewed in these types of cases, where someone's mental state is gradually escalating and putting themselves or others at risk. Family need to be informed of what people need and to be advised of the importance of them being compliant. Meredith said she knew of other families who, like hers, had struggled to be part of a loved one's treatment and recovery because, quote, they are excluded by privacy and confidentiality issues. These other families, just like ours, lack relevant information, and that has devastating consequences. I will continue to love and support our son as his father and I have always done.
What a fascinating insight into, I guess, the mindset of a mother, wife, in that environment, knowing now what she knows, understanding how much wasn't understood. What a fascinating situation. And as she said, as much as that person is the reason her husband no longer exists, he is still my son, and we will continue to love and support him in that sense. And, making mention of his sister as well and her life being, because of course her brother is the cause of the death of her father in that sense. What a fascinating insight into Meredith's mind and situation at that time.
I want everybody out there to try and exercise for a minute. If you, like me, have a child who has moved from childhood to adulthood, you know there's a point where you can no longer control what they do. All you can do is give advice and hope and pray that they listen to that advice and do the right thing. You have to step aside.
Yeah.
You have to allow them to be adults. You can't legally control them anymore. Take that anxiety you feel when they get in a car and drive somewhere, go to a party with someone you don't know, start dating someone you don't necessarily approve of. Now lay a mental illness over the top of that.
Yeah.
Imagine not knowing whether or not they were taking their meds. Imagine not even perhaps knowing whether or not they were mentally ill.
Yeah.
Imagine being excluded because they have that right to privacy, but you have lost your right to know what they're doing.
And that's a really interesting point. And that was something that just listening to Meredith's words there, the concept of, they legally, everything was done correctly.
Lawful.
Lawful, that's right. It was a lawful situation that Cy had become an adult, and therefore his mental state and whatever he was going under is his private business alone, even outside of his mother, father, sister, it's his. And therefore, from a legal perspective, they can't say, hey, as someone who is his mother, carer, partner, relative, whatever that is, we can't tell you that, hey, we're concerned this person isn't necessarily following what we would like them to do. If that was the case, how fascinating is that? Legally, a lawful perspective, as you said, it's lawful in the terms of, is it just around that? Well, that's to be determined, I guess, and understood.
Take it one step further. Cy was still living under their roof.
Yeah.
He was still, to use the vernacular, eating their food, using their electricity,
Correct.
Using their internet connection, offering to let people come and couch surf at the house.
Yeah.
But they had no control over whether or not he was taking his meds.
Yeah. And that obviously was Meredith's victim impact statement that she gave, and
First time she'd spoken.
And as I say, look, just remarkable and really interesting to understand her mindset through that process.
And it echoes some of the things we heard in like the Jaden Lower case.
Sure.
With the family of Michelle in that case saying, if only he'd gotten some help.
Yes.
If you think of Vicky Wagner and the Chamberlains, if only there'd been some help at the right time.
Yeah.
This is Meredith saying exactly the same thing as all those other families.
Can I get you, if you can, cast your mind back and go back to that moment when you're in court and you're hearing Meredith say this and you're seeing her deliver this statement? What was her situation? What was she like? Was she emotional? Was she controlled, calm? What did that look like for someone sitting in there, hearing this and obviously feeling the gravity of the emotive state of what's happening? What was that moment like?
My strongest memory is actually Cy in all of that.
Right.
He's sitting, watching by video link,
Sure.
dressed not in prison greens, not in tracksuit anymore, not in the way he'd been, but nicely cut hair, tie, blue long sleeve shirt, just listening.
Right.
And I think it was the first time in all of this that I really felt that he was engaged.
Okay.
Not because he didn't care earlier, but because he was medicated to the eyeballs, because he
Sure.
was on all sorts of things that he needed to, assess his health and help his
Yeah.
rehabilitation. He was laser focused on this whole thing.
Wow.
And that's my strongest memory.
Yeah.
I don't actually remember Meredith's demeanour
Okay.
because Cy's was so compelling.
And that's another piece. I mean, through all this, whatever we think, feel, or otherwise around that, Cy's sitting there watching this happen around him, and
Yeah.
this is his world that's unfolding now, actually outside of his control. He actually doesn't have control over what's happening to him at the moment. Watching this happen, watching his mother give this statement about his situation, his father's death, what a just a intriguing situation. That's why I was so keen to ask you. Like, I wasn't expecting to get the Cy Walsh aspect. I was thinking Meredith,
Yeah.
but by extension, as you said, wow, what a moment to see Cy have to sit through this process also.
And that lack of control that you're talking about that he had over the situation was about to be made permanent.
Okay.
Because should be the surprise of absolutely nobody at this point.
Yeah.
Justice Anne Bampton said, I find beyond reasonable doubt that you were mentally incompetent at the time that your father died, and therefore you are not guilty of murder. Justice Anne Bampton agreed with everything that the prosecution and defence had said. She found Phil Walsh was stabbed 20 times, with 2 of those wounds being fatal.
Yeah.
She found that Cy was affected by undiagnosed, untreated schizophrenia at the time, that he was not intoxicated by drugs, that his assault was driven by nothing other than mental illness, meaning that he was unable to comprehend the wrongfulness of his actions due to its severity. This is what she said. Each psychiatrist has expressed the opinion that Walsh was suffering schizophrenia and, at the time of the conduct alleged to give rise to the offence, was actively psychotic. So it was affecting him in that moment. Not just you have schizophrenia, but you were at that exact moment.
Yeah.
They are all of the opinion that he suffered from mental incompetence at the time of the conduct, such that he was unable to reason with a moderate degree of sense and composure about the wrongfulness of his actions. We've talked about that in our previous episodes.
Yeah.
That's a legalistic ruling. Here's the bit that everybody wanted to know. I accept the toxicology evidence regarding tests performed on blood, urine, and hair samples taken from Walsh following the conduct confirm he was not intoxicated by any substance at the time of the conduct.
Right, okay.
I find that Walsh was not labouring under a drug-induced psychosis at the time of the conduct. I find he was suffering from a psychotic episode as a result of schizophrenia, which at the time of the conduct was undiagnosed and untreated. That's unequivocal.
Right.
There is nothing left now.
Mm-hmm.
We have been through everything all this time as investigators, as lawyers, as judges. We've gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb.
Yeah.
Literally down to that first strand of hair we talked about all those episodes ago. And we have concluded that there was nothing in Cy Walsh's system at that time.
Yeah. And I mean, that is the most, I guess, comprehensive, conclusive, in a frank and strict sort of process there that tells us exactly what the situation was. As you said, no, I didn't know if you were making a pun there about, a fine-tooth comb pulling out that hair, but at that point, we now know, at the time, no substances were causing this situation. We did have someone who we now know was undiagnosed as a schizophrenic who was having an episode, psychotic episode, at that moment of the incident when it occurred. That right there is very, very black, white, succinct. This is what we now know. So for everyone out there who thinks they know the story, everyone out there who says, oh, well, this was the case, and, he was on drugs, or, well, he killed that, don't care. You've heard it right there from Justice Anne Bampton, who has given that ruling right now. This was the state of play. Regardless what anyone else wants to think they know, that is, as it is, the terms of the situation, black, white, forever and a day, that's what the situation was.
And if you still don't like that and you still refuse to accept that, there are several episodes before this one that you can go back and listen to again. And I encourage you to, because we have done this for a reason. We have laid all of this out in order for you to come to this moment. If this was a maths test, you can see the workings.
Yep.
You can see all the pieces of machinery that have come together to reach this point. Cy Walsh was mentally incompetent and acutely psychotic when he killed his father. That means he killed his father, but he did not murder his father. He did not get away with murder.
Yeah.
The poor young man is a killer.
Yes.
For the rest of his life, he is a killer. You can absolutely call Cy Walsh a killer. You cannot say he got away with murder because he did not.
And that comes back to what I said right at the start, in the intro to this, the reckoning and the reasoning. We understand the reckoning of what we think and how it is. We now know the reasoning of the actuality of that situation. So, we now know. We've had that verdict handed to us by Justice Bampton, which means we now know what we know. What I'm interested in is, after the fact, what can you say about this? What can you report? What can't you report? What happens from this point forward?
So, Cy Walsh is ordered to serve a limiting term of life.
Right.
As we know, that means you go to James Nash House.
Mm-hmm.
One day you will be assessed. There will be all sorts of step downs if necessary,
Sure.
but that's far off in the future.
Yeah.
Right now, it's you're going to James Nash and you're going to stay there until you're well.
So that's a limiting term and the environment we're serving the limiting term in. Is
That's
that correct? Right.
All set. For myself and for everyone in the media, the next question was the suppression orders.
Yes.
Those suppression orders that had governed everything from the beginning.
Correct.
The things that I knew that nobody else knew, the 7 boxes.
Yep.
I stood up and asked for the suppression orders to be lifted.
Mm-hmm.
Her Honour said the time had come.
Okay.
So we were off to the races.
Right.
And mental image I'll never forget.
So at that point there, though, you had stories pre-written that you needed to, and your words top and tail, but you had your stuff ready to go. Is that right?
That's right. I had everything
Okay.
ready to go. So this is what I'm saying. The mental image, and I'm laughing and I shouldn't. I apologise to all of my colleagues. The hearing for Cy Walsh was up on the 3rd level of the court. I stepped out onto the lobby. I watched my colleagues tear off past me down the stairs as fast as they could to the Supreme Court Registry.
Okay.
Now, the Supreme Court Registry is different to the Magistrates Court Registry.
Sure.
Magistrates Court Registry on the ground floor of that building is where I went through 7 boxes of
Correct.
documents a year earlier.
Mm.
Those 7 boxes of documents now lived in the Supreme Court Registry, across the road, directly beneath our feet,
Right.
which meant that everyone from Channel 7, 9, 10, the ABC, the Australian, Fox Sports, anyone else who was
Any
there
other media outlet wanting to know what this story is about.
was about to completely bum rush the poor staff of the
Sure.
Supreme Court Registry as they tried to fight each other for these 7 boxes of documents.
Absolutely.
They had from 10:30 in the morning to 6 p.m. that night to get their stories together.
Right.
I walked out, looked at my phone, and sent a text message of 3 keys, 3 characters.
Yeah.
G-O full stop to
Right.
my editor. Within seconds,
Mm-hmm.
those articles that I had written a year before
Mm-hmm.
went up on the advertiser website.
Sure.
Bang, bang, bang. Pictures, links, hyperlinks back to previous stories, long explanations. Pretty much everything we talked about from those 7 boxes of
Yeah.
documents, broken down the way we broke them down here on this show.
Yep.
3 big articles. The editor rings me and says, great, come on back to the Tizer building. We're going to lay them out on the page. We're giving you 6 pages.
Yeah, right.
Fantastic. Finally, I think everything's going my way. I've lost the exclusive.
Mhm.
Everyone else is going to have it tonight. They're not going to have it with the same depth. It's going to run online all day. It's probably not going to be the front page anymore. I understand that because something else will happen in the day.
Sure.
That's all fine. But, finally this story is told and it's going to be told right. And that's when the lights went out.
What do you mean the lights went out?
If you think back to September of 2016,
Mm.
that was the day that South Australia blacked out.
Oh, okay. Yes, I remember that. That was, and when you say blacked out, that's not to be understated. That was pretty much the entire state just went dark from about, I'm going to say 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Everything just shut down. And I actually vividly remember where I was living at the time, and I was under candlelight for about 6 or 7 or 8 hours at that point. I think I ended up going to bed and just waiting for the power to come on the next morning.
That's right, and you're not alone. So for our South Australian listeners, all of you are nodding going, I remember that. For our interstate and overseas listeners, something went wrong with the power supply to South Australia. Every single home was blacked out, every building, everything.
Correct.
The way the South Australian power system's designed, the CBD, the Central Business District of Adelaide, the square mile that is the city, is supposed to be blackout proof.
Right.
It went down too.
Yeah.
Hospitals on emergency generators, everybody panicking. All of a sudden, the TV stations had no way of broadcasting their stories.
Of course.
The website went dark. Nobody could access it.
Okay.
The stories were there.
Yeah.
People interstate could read it, but no one in
Right.
South Australia could read it.
Of course.
Now, fortunately, the paper has its own backup generator.
Right.
So we were still generating the pages because we intended to publish the paper because the printing press has its own generator as well.
Right.
So we're still going to get the paper out, and the editor says to me, don't worry. I know a lot of the paper's now going to be blackout coverage, but you'll still get your 6 pages because this is an important story.
Yeah.
Just as he finished telling me that, the lights went out inside the advertiser building.
Okay.
There was about a 30-second to a minute combined newsroom heart attack.
Panic.
As we thought, right, well, we're screwed too. We're not going to be able to get this story out. And then the generator kicked over.
Yeah, right.
And all the lights came on and all the computers came on. And the editor gave the word, finish everything now.
Just in case it goes out again, I'd
I
imagine.
reckon we pulled that paper together in an hour.
Yeah, right.
Record time, and just got it to the printing press as fast as we could.
Yep.
Because we didn't know how much more juice we had left.
Correct.
And that's all great and exciting and funny, and Sean got his exclusive in the end anyway, didn't
By
he?
default, yeah.
By
Okay,
default.
sure.
Was Homer Simpson say the 2 sweetest words in the English language? Default.
Default.
But here's the thing. To this day, as you and I have been recording this series,
Yeah.
we've had people, knowledgeable people, journalists, lawyers, radio station staff come up to us and say, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yet all this information has been out there. We reported it at the time. But nobody saw it because of the blackout. Nobody took it in because they were quite understandably concerned with other things. It's almost as if the blackout swallowed up the one piece of the Cy Walsh story that gave everybody the answers.
Sean, the irony of that story and the exposure and the gravity and the huge spectacle that it was to this state would almost get forgotten when it was the most important part to understand.
Yeah, it wasn't the suppression orders that knocked it down. It wasn't the in-court antics that knocked it down. It was something outside of everybody's control, and it means that there is not just a blackout in South Australia's electrical history, but a blackout in our understanding of the Cy Walsh case.
It's funny you say our understanding of the Cy Walsh case, because blackouts aside, you've got the story, your version is up there, it is there, but it doesn't have the impact that we would hope it has to the wider audience that it should have. We know that. What's the impact here to Cy, though? Because we know this whole process, and I want to bring this back. So at that point, we know Cy goes to James Nash House. We know that one day down the track, in this lifetime limiting term that he has, will be reassessed and looked at. So that brings us up to speed. Is that where we are now?
It would be where we were up to, if not for one unexpected medical diagnosis that changed the entire case one final time.
And with that, to find out what that one final time would be, we look forward to speaking to you again in our next episode. And until then, we just want to thank everyone who has listened to the broadcast on 5AA, or you've caught the episodes via iTunes or Spotify. As always, please go to those platforms, rate, review, subscribe, do all that wonderful stuff. Send us your feedback. Tell us how you're feeling about this now we're at this point of this series. To do that, of course, you can absolutely catch us at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. You can, of course, catch Sean and all of his non-blackout related Adelaide true crime with the advertiser at Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. And until we rejoin to understand where is Cy now, what is the next piece of this, as always, enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.